Hello, hello. All right, we're gonna start to cruise along here. I just have a few brief announcements, and then I'll introduce the keynote. First off, our keynote, Kelly McCullough, is a sci-fi fantasy author. He has several books, a little box up here, and if anybody would like to purchase a book, we will have a signing at the end of the keynote from 1 until I think 2 o'clock. 1 until 2 o'clock out here in the hallway. So if you're interested, just be aware that that's going on. If you're staying for Sunday's lunch, I know I mentioned this yesterday, I'm going to mention it again. We're having a hard time locking down meal numbers. So if you haven't already stopped by the registration table and let them know that you're expecting to stay, and they'll add your head count to the tally. That would be great if you could do that as soon as possible. All right? Great. So, without any further ado, it's a great honor and a privilege to introduce our keynote. He is, like I said, a sci-fi fantasy author, a children's book author, and he has even written a graphic novel for NASA about the Hubble telescope.
It's about something with the Hubble telescope.
Something with the Hubble telescope. So please welcome Kelly McCullough.
My pleasure. All right, so I'm going to sit here on this table because I'm completely allergic to podiums. I went to a hippie school, and getting behind podium just makes me go. Anyway, I'm going to start out. I'm entirely a creature of the digital age of writing. You can tell by my paper notes here. Without computers, I wouldn't be a writer, quite literally. With them, I'm a highly successful novelist and short fiction writer, and let's see if my technology is working here. Yes. So that's more or less what I do. My publications so far include 12 novels that are either in print or forthcoming from major publishers, mostly Ace Penguin, but also Macmillan's Fywell and Friends. Dozens of short stories, the graphic novel that Daniel mentioned, one comic script, various bits of microfiction. In addition to the commercial work, like Daniel mentioned, I had done work with the NASA and the Hubble Space Telescope. That was a comic called Hanny and the Vorwerp, and it's about citizen science. It's available for free in PDF form. I believe there's a link from my website. If there's not, I'm sure there will be one later this afternoon or early tomorrow morning, depending on how on top of things I am. I also did some work with the National Science Foundation, writing short stories to help middle school students learn physical science and physical chemistry. So I'm going to talk mostly about how I do things rather than what I do in this, because it's a conference for writing and computers, and I write with computers. So let's begin with the interface. Like most school children of my age, I started out doing assignments with crayons and pens, as we mostly do. I managed all right, but there's a bit of a problem with that for me. Let's see. Because of this, I have a mostly invisible birth defect. My thumbs are not fully opposable, so using a pen is not easy for me. A typewriter was a little bit better, but there are still issues. I can't really touch type. So I can write by hand, but it's never going to be elegant. Okay. So despite the difficulty I have in actually doing the writing, all of my teachers over the years told me what a wonderful writer I was and how much they appreciated what I was doing. Still, it had never occurred to me to become a writer until 1989. And that's when I shifted over into writing as my mode of communication. And why 1989? Well, two things. One of them is about technology. And I grew up with computers quite literally. My grandmother was a radio technician, and she built computer test equipment for Sperry Univac. So we had lived in North Dakota. I grew up in rural poverty till about the age of 6. We moved down to the Twin Cities. My grandmother started building test equipment while my mother went to school to become a programmer. So I rode my way into the middle of the class on the computer revolution. The first computer in my house was an Apple IIe, which I wrote my high school and early college papers on. There we go. Ancient technology. It was a little bit better than the computer, a little bit better than the typewriter, because it had a really, really important thing for someone who can't type well, and that's the backspace key. And I still use the backspace key probably one time for every 5 or 10 keystrokes when I'm typing. It's like, oh, that's not quite a sentence, back up. And I do a lot of that. It was a huge, huge improvement on the typewriter. But it wasn't the Apple IIe that made me a writer either. It was, in fact, a sudden change in life goals and the original Macintosh 128 and the mouse. The mouse was an amazing piece of technology for me, that first single-button mouse, because it suddenly allowed me to be able to move around big blocks of text and make changes and corrections really quickly and easily. And that simply wasn't an option on the typewriter or by hand, and since those were both laborious technologies for me, the Mac 128 and the mouse was a huge, huge opportunity for me to be able to write and communicate in a better way. So I'm going to take a quick side trip into life goals here to explain what had to do with the Macintosh and why that suddenly was important. So as I said earlier, I went to a hippie school, and I was raised by hippies, basically free-range hippies. And they told me all through my childhood that I could be absolutely anything I wanted to be. And the funny thing about this is if you go to a hippie school and you're raised by hippies and they tell you this constantly, you actually come to believe it. Which is, you know, it has its pluses and its minuses. So what I really wanted to be at that point in time was an actor. And I focused on theater. My degree is in theater. Basically from the age of 12, I was working in theater. And then I was maybe a year from my graduation when I met the woman who I was eventually going to marry. And I fell head over heels in love, and we were spending a lot of time together. And suddenly something occurred to me. You would have thought it would have occurred to me earlier being in theater, but being in theater, weekends, nights, lots of travel, and having a life are not entirely compatible goals. I did get it. It took 10 years to get there, but I finally twigged that. So I said, okay, I actually kind of want to have a life, and I'm good in theater, but I am not good enough to really make a career of it. What am I going to do? As someone who is very artistically inclined and very artistically motivated, I need a creative outlet. If I don't write or don't perform for a while, I start doing what my wife calls leaking weirdness. So if I'm writing, if I'm working on a show, I basically don't remember my dreams, and I'm a completely normal person to interface with. If I am not doing those things, I wake up and start doing things like, Princess Moina moved from the milking stand. And my wife will say, what are you talking about? No, a Connecticut buffalo in King Heifer's court. It's a graphic novel. It's the King Arthur's court, only it's all cows. You need to go write something, like preferably yesterday, so we didn't have this conversation. So I needed to move on to something else artistic. And I said, well, what else can I do? What else do I do that I get a lot of cookies for? I got a lot of cookies for theater. Ooh, that's very good. I loved your performance. Cookies are great. Getting paid is better, but cookies are good. So what else did I get a lot of cookies for? And what occurred to me was writing. Because, as I said, even though it was difficult for me earlier on before the advent of the mouse, I got a lot of praise on doing those things. So I said, okay, I love science fiction and fantasy. I have this new computer that's letting me write much more easily. Maybe I'll try and write a novel. This is a great idea. So I sat down, and over the course of about 4 months, I wrote my first novel. And it's a terrible book. That's fundamentally, first novels are always terrible. There are things in there that I've salvaged. Some of it's gone into other stories, but not a great book. But what happened was I fell in love for the second time in about 6 months. And I fell in love with the process of writing novels. And now, 20 books on. Wow, 20 books on. I feel old. I've never looked back. So, jump forward here. Computers, technological evolution. So computers and technology made me a writer. And computers and technology have been changing constantly in the 20 years that I've been in this business and have made my life very different and in many ways better. So Let me start with this. When I started, everything was done on paper. That ream of paper represents a little bit less than the average novel length. My very first novel, this way, there's the Mac 128 that I was going to put up earlier. And here's the Image Writer 1. So my first novel and the first short stories I wrote were all printed on this beast, which sounds roughly like a machine gun going off in the next room. Continuous loop of paper. When you're printing out a 400-page novel, on that thing it takes about 8.5 hours of a machine gun going off in the next room. Your cats don't like that very much, and neither does your wife. So what happens is, first you're like, oh, this is awful. And 20 minutes go by, and you're thinking, OK, I've got to do something, or I'm going to throw this thing out the window. So I ended up putting a giant box over the top of it, and then padding that entirely with pillows. And then instead of sounding like a machine gun going off in the next room, it sounded like a machine going off a floor below. So, muted, but really not enough. So we said goodbye to the cats who said, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, die, 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 and wandered off to the park. So when that printing was done, and we came back and the cats were like, oh, thank God, the noise has stopped. Never do this to us again, monkey. I took that copy, and I took it down to Kinko's, our local copy place, and I had them print up 2 copies. And when I sent it off to publishers, I sent it off in a box with a self-addressed stamped envelope, a SAISY, which many people in the writing industry don't even know what that is these days. And the reason I sent it with that was because despite it being a huge piece of paper and relatively expensive to ship, shipping was much, much cheaper than printing and copying. The other reason that with the SAISY is it's a holdover from the true typing days, the really barbaric times of being a professional author, when there may be only 1 or 2 copies in existence. So one of my major costs as an aspiring writer, so that very first year when obviously I sent out a lot of stuff and didn't make any money because that's how you start out as a writer. Generally that's how you go on as a writer, but occasionally you get lucky. I spent about $100 on shipping costs that year and made no money whatsoever. Last year, I made about $55,000 on my fiction, and my total mail costs were about $5. I think it was like $482. And I could have gotten away with less than that, but I think I sent a couple of thank you cards to editors. So email has absolutely transformed my industry. The giant ream of paper here is no longer such an important part of my life. I used to spend about going through one manuscript, sending stuff off to my writers group, all the copying. I used to go through about a box of paper a novel. With the novels now, sometimes they don't actually ever get printed. It's just revolutionary. If I go into my archives, I can see that I started, using email for primary communication in about 1996. There were still a few letters, but everybody in the science fiction fantasy industry are early adopters, and they're like, look, it's a new technology. We must do this. We are going to step into the future. But it wasn't until 1998 that most of those places started accepting submissions by email. And I think it was probably mid-2000s, maybe 2005, 2006, where most of the magazines and publishers these days will now accept electronic submission. And it's still not the case everywhere. So in 2005, when I sold my first novel, which had been written sometime before, and this is not my first novel, it was my 4th novel written, my editor wanted the final version to come in 2 draft paper copies and a backup in Microsoft Word on a floppy disk, a 4 1/4 floppy disk. So that was one of the late paper, and my first 3 novels were all turned in that way. My 4th one, MythOS, was also turned in with pretty much that same technology, but revolution. I got to email a copy in as well as the floppy disk, which was very, very exciting. And I think actually most of the work got done off of the copy I emailed in, because they were in the transition to an all-electronic world. Okay. So all of those books were also copy edited and proofed on paper. So they would take even Mythos, they would take the copy, do all of the copy editing, mail the manuscript back to me. I would make all of my changes on paper and then mail the manuscript back to them. Then there would be next round of printing with proofs that they would come back. But there are so many opportunities for your manuscript to go missing in the mail, along with literally hundreds of person hours of effort on copy editing. Again, love the email. So with Broken Blade, which is my second series and my sixth book, was the very first book with Penguin Ace that was on their new entirely electronic process. Was fantastic. I finished the book, I emailed it to my editor, I got an email back 10 minutes later, I've got the book, we're going to send it on, and we went all through the book with Microsoft Word and comments. That was basically how we handled all of the copy editing, all of the proofing. In that case, the only reason I saw a paper copy before the actual printed book is because my wife usually does the final proofing stage of my books. This is because by the time I get there, I've read the book 8 times I was on a 6-month release schedule, so I was writing a book in 6 months, and then 1 year later it would come out. So I had read the book about 8 times in 3 months, and I can't even see it at that point. So she would go through them. I prefer proofing on the computer, but she wanted a paper copy. So we did the proofing, found all of the mistakes, scanned those with a big scanner, and then emailed that back. I'm like, yay, back to electronic, so much simpler. But the files were so big at that point that it took 5 separate emails to send all of the maybe 80 pages that had marks on them. So towards the end of that process, what happened was I moved on to using this as my scanning device. My iPhone. I've got a little box. I drop stuff in, I set it on top, it's got a hole in it, I use this as a scanner. The electronic files are right on my phone, and I send them straight to my editor. So if you'd told me when I was starting out with paper and that Mac 128 that I would be using this as one of my primary tools, and that it not only was it a phone, it was a sophisticated computer that I can take with me and phone internationally, that I'd use it for memos, calendar, voice recognition, translation, alarm clock, book promotion tool, research tool, and actually this is the primary way I read books these days is on my phone, I would have said, wow, I think I'm going to like the future a lot. So I want to take a moment to contrast where I started to where I am now, MacBook Air and the iPhone. And along the way, that's the PowerBook 100, which was my first laptop, which was a huge step forward. Suddenly, I wasn't tethered to my office anymore. This is the book that I wrote my first successful novel on. I lent it to my brother-in-law, who's also a science fiction writer for a number of years, and when he brought it back to me, he had done a case mod on it to make it into the web goblin from my first novel, so it's now hung up on the wall. It still booted the last time I tried it about 1.5 years ago. So this, as a reading device, is what I want to talk about next in terms of my industry. Ebooks are an absolutely transformative technology for publishing. In some ways, ebooks aren't all that different from paper. If I use a Kindle app on my iPad, the interface really isn't that different from the Codex, which is a 2,000-year-old technology. I think if you handed Julius Caesar an iPad and he didn't immediately keel over from tech shock from the lighted screen, it'd take him maybe a minute or two to get the hang of how to use it as a book. So not only has writing not really changed enormously, the ebook doesn't really change the reader experience that much. It hasn't changed the way I, as a writer, interface with the production process. It's changed some other things, but I still write the manuscript on my laptop. It still goes through editorial, copy edits, typesetting, book design, cover, and proofing. And fundamentally, the fixed costs are similar too. I know that we think of ebooks as being much cheaper to produce, but the proofing, the copy editing, the design, my publisher's legal department, which is a greatly underrated service, are all there for a ebook as well. And in terms of producing it, a hardcover book actually only costs a couple of bucks to produce. So there is some difference in cost for the physical item, but it's less than you would imagine as part of the cover of the cost. But that's where the similarities end and the transformation of an industry starts. Distribution and storage are at the top of the list. So if I want to start reading a book as someone who reads mostly on the phone, I can hop online 1 minute after it's released, click one button, and be reading this new book within 5 minutes. That just wasn't the case with paper books. Not only was there the trip to the bookstore, but on that first day, unless you're J.K. Rowling or someone else who's at the sort of that level of rollout, the chances that it's on the shelves are not 100% for that first day. Or it might come out a week earlier, which kind of messes up the way they do bestseller lists, but not an enormous point for most of you. So it's infinitely more convenient, and it's faster, and it's enormously cheaper. Shipping costs are fractions of a penny. Warehouse is eliminated entirely. The storage costs for one copy of the book are approximately the same as the storage costs for an infinite number for the publisher. And this has huge implications for personal convenience as well. So I can carry an entire library on my pocket and bring 1,000 books on vacation without cluttering my luggage, which my wife is very happy about because I am no longer going, well, we're going to be there for a week. We need to bring at least, 10 books each, right? That's an extra bag. So, another advantage of this, nobody knows how big my to-read pile is. So, I used to have the giant stack next to the bed, and my wife would say, hey, you should probably read some of those before you add more, because you've got, 100 books there. With this, I can have an infinite number of books that I haven't read. No one knows to make me feel guilty about it. I can read at night without waking my wife up with the backlit screen. I usually read white text on black. It's not visible more than a few feet away. This is good because reading in bed is very popular with me, and reading in bed with a book light was much less popular with my wife. I can pick up a new book on the road without stopping at a store. I can literally, as we're driving down the road, say, oh, I finished this book. Does it have a sequel? Yes, it does. Click. And be ready to start reading again in a few minutes. As an author, I can get e-copies of manuscripts. I get a lot of people writing to me, editors saying, hey, can you blurb this book? And if they send me a paper copy, then it has all of those problems. But if they send me an e-copy, I can sit and read it in the spare minutes, which is great. I always have a book with me. Also, this is a waterproof case, so I can read my books in the hot tub. This is not an insignificant thing. As a reader, I absolutely adore ebooks. I'm also a huge fan of them as a writer. If someone reads one of my books and they want more, it is absolutely dead simple for them to get my entire backlist. They can do it in a matter of minutes and conveniently. I love bookstores, but many bookstores won't have everything in stock. And if they have book 1, book 2, book 4, and book 5 in a series, I might sell book 2, and I might well not sell book 4 and book 5 at that point. But if you're going with ebook, they can say, oh, I'll just grab the whole series. And it's very easy. That benefits me both in terms of ease and convenience of purchase and in my royalty percentages, actually. For a paperback novel, simplifying, I make about 55 cents. I make more for a hardcover, but for an ebook that's the equivalent of the paperback novel, I make about $1.22. So that is a not insignificant extra chunk of change in my pocket. Part of the reason for that is that my publisher has fewer costs associated with the ebook, but I think perhaps a larger reason for that is that my publisher looks at Amazon and they say, look, Kelly McCullough's books all up there. It has never been easier for an author to say, I don't like this deal. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take my next book. I'm going to hire a cover and I'm going to put it up on Amazon myself and make a much, much larger percentage. If you're selling a book for over $3, you're making 70% of cover price versus, I don't know, 22%, I think, for ebook for my publisher. So it is very easy for me to go into competition with my publisher, and my publisher is aware of this. And this is one of the reasons that they're treating authors in a nicer way where it comes to ebooks. And in fact, current data suggests that if you want to have a successful, and by successful I mean being able to eat and have a roof over your head author, unless you're at the very top of the game, it is better for you to be a hybrid author. So you have some books coming out from your large press publisher who is doing things like promotion and really good professional covers and all of those things, and then a few books that you put out yourself as well, because you get a higher percentage of the profits for those, but your publisher is footing most of the publicity bill. This is a great plan. So I am, in fact, in the process right now of dipping my toes into those waters, which brings me to some of the downsides of ebooks and indie publishing. There's a lot to be said for it, but it's also got some issues. First off, there's a huge pricing disconnect for readers. Readers get physical books. They've had centuries to get used to the idea of them and paying for the books. They tend to believe that they understand how books are priced, and they accept that having a physical item has associated costs. Ebooks, on the other hand, are pretty much magic. The internet has trained consumers that text is free, but of course it's not. Writers who aren't in it purely for the cookies, and like I said, I like my cookies, but I like to eat too. And so I need to get paid. So do the editors, the copy editors, the proofers, book designers, basically all those fixed costs. It's worth noting, particularly with ebooks, that the long tail effect means that some of those costs can then be written off over a much longer time than with the way physical books are handled right now. And that's all due to the Thor Power Tools decision, but you don't care about that. And so I'm hoping that that will be factored into the way books are published going forward, but it's going to take a while for that to get into the market. And one of the other things that readers tend to forget is some of the cost recovery from websites, from that free text, come from options that really aren't available to the novelist. They're a little bit available to the short story writer. For example, if I put ads in my books, my reader's going to be very, very unhappy with me. So that's a cost recovery mechanism that's just really not open to me. So price disconnect is part of what drives e-piracy. People believe that books should be free and act on that. The ease of internet distribution and the negligible costs of housing copies is another big component to that. Now, personally, I have very mixed feelings about e-piracy. I know there are a lot of people in my industry who are very, very unhappy about it. I'm not at all certain that most of those books that are pirated represent lost sales. I think many of them are people who wouldn't have picked up the book otherwise. And for most authors, obscurity is a much, much worse villain than e-piracy. But it's an important issue in the industry, and it's one of those things that you have to think about when you're talking about the way technology has affected publishing. And I mean, people have always copied and distributed art outside of the normal channels, but when it involved physical copies, like the samizdat in Russia, that's a lot more labor intensive. It's not that instantaneous process that we have now. And of course, it's not just an issue for text. Look at the music industry, or more closer to my home for me, the audiobook industry. Audiobooks used to be a hugely expensive and involved process. Beyond the price of hiring a reader, there were production and distribution costs that made audiobooks very, very expensive generally. When I got into the industry, I knew that unless I became a bestseller, I knew this, I would never have an audiobook because audiobooks were so expensive to produce. Because of that, the e-piracy industry could totally have killed audiobooks. There was that moment when we started seeing the e-piracy music, and we're over looking at audiobooks and saying, the margins are so slim here and the costs are so high, this has the potential to just wipe out audiobooks. Only it didn't. And this is one of those places where the flip side of the technology comes into account. The same technology that made e-piracy of audiobooks easy made production of audiobooks easy. When you're distributing your audiobooks as an MP3 file, and where you've got really good microphones, and rather than having to have a studio, you can farm out the production of that audiobook to actors all over the country who are picking up some of their money doing voice work, it suddenly becomes much, much, much cheaper to do an audiobook. So now I think 6 of my 12 novels are out on audiobook, which would just simply not have been possible at sort of the level of sales that I'm making in the past. And in fact, I am listening to my audiobooks from my first series on this phone here again. Not only is it my main reader, it's my main listening device. So, and that's part of the reason why I'm considering, we're doing an ongoing remodel. Everybody who has a house, it's like, oh, I got to do something else. I'm considering putting a small studio in the basement so that I can do things like record short stories. There really isn't an industry for short stories, but there's now a market for them. So particularly short stories read by the author. So that's a way of monetizing a part of my production that just didn't exist before. So that's one of the ways that technology is making it easier for writers to make a living. And that brings me back to independent publishing. Beyond price and piracy, which are, some issues, there's an opportunity cost to indie publishing. Now, I'm hugely in favor of it, but one of the problems with publishing your own book is you have to do one of two things. You have to be your own marketing department, your own copy editing department, your own publicity department, all of those things, or you have to pay up front to do that. One of the nice things about working with a major New York publisher is they pay all of those costs and they pay me, and that's before I ever start writing the book. So I am able to feel comfortable and at ease that I'm going to be able to eat going forward while I produce the book. With indie publishing, that's more of an issue, particularly if it's your only avenue. So I'm going to mention something called Yogg's Law, which has changed radically in the past 5 years. When I got involved in the industry, there's John McDonald is an author, and he used to be on the internet as Yogg sysadmin. And Yogg's Law was one of the iron rules for writers. And Yogg's Law is money always flows to the author. Anytime that you get a contract where money is flowing away from the author, something has gone horribly wrong. And with the big mainstream press, that's still the case. But Yogg's Law doesn't apply to indie publishing because you are your own publisher. So in addition to being the writer, and all money flows to the writer, you're also your publisher, and an awful lot of money flows away from the publisher. So I don't want to be my own department or spend half my time on publicity. I want to write books. I am a highly trained and specialized specialist. So are the folks in the editorial department and marketing. Marketing is underrated in the industry. They're a huge pain in the butt sometimes, but they can do things for you that you as the author just simply aren't going to be able to do. They have skills that they have mastered, which you just don't have. Okay, so, and that brings me to too much time spent on marketing. So it used to be that as a writer, you'd write your book, then barring it becoming a bestseller where you have to start doing the book tours and things, it depends. It's kind of a miserable process, but it's kind of cool at the same time. But you would write your book, you would send it in, and you were basically done. You might do 1 or 2 book signings at your local bookseller, but you were off the hook. You go write the next book, life's great. That's more or less where things were when I got into the internet. It got into the industry. And then the internet happened. Suddenly, writers are expected to have an online presence. And when I started out, that online presence was usually like a blog and a website, which was, it was a little onerous. It wasn't much. You blog once or twice a week. You have some hosting costs, some design costs. It's not that bad. That's good because I also suspect it didn't do an enormous amount for most writers. Not a big bar. Then came the 800-pound gorilla of internet marketing, social media, which has been yet another industry-transforming technology. So I was not an early adopter here. In fact, I had to be pushed hard by my wife. I didn't want anything to do with it. She was right. She usually is. So these days, an author is expected to have an online social media presence. I currently maintain presence on Twitter, Facebook, G+, and Ello. I also have a website. If I had more time, I'd be keeping up on my Tsu account. I have one. I haven't done anything with it. And I'd probably have a Tumblr as well. So I spend a fair amount of time on social media. Some of it is very productive. Some of it is... So my friend Dave has this thing he calls things that look like writing and feel like writing that aren't really writing. And a lot of the social media stuff falls into that case. It's, ooh, I'm doing this thing online. I'm talking to a fan. This is work. Okay, let's talk about scale for a second. In order for me to make a living as a writer, I need to be selling 20 to 30,000 copies of my books per year. That's sort of the floor. You can make a much better living as things go up, and there are things like the audiobooks and foreign markets that allow you to get more money out of it. But I really need to be selling tens of thousands of books a year. And talking to that one fan, while it feels productive, is not necessarily productive in terms of scale. I still think it's worthwhile. I still think I get a lot of pleasure out of it. That's one of most of the things that I do for marketing my books are things that I find to be entertaining. because I'm not entirely convinced any of them work. And if I'm going to do something that may not work, I at least ought to have fun doing it. So a good bit of media, social media falls into those categories. And because of that, okay, I have to admit, I've bought some software. One piece is called Antisocial, another piece is called Freedom. What Freedom does is it turns off the internet on my computer for a set amount of time, and the only way to get around it is to reboot my computer, which is a huge hassle. So Freedom is nice if you really desperately, you're on deadline, you really need to get to work and you have no willpower, and then you set your phone like on the table in the other room so that you can't just ship over to Twitter there. I prefer Antisocial, and that's a program that allows you to lock out specific websites. So I turn off all of my social media and all of my politics blogs. But I can still do things like I can still email with my editor, which is, that's an important thing. And I can still do research. And most of my research these days is done over the internet. So if I turn the internet off, and suddenly I need to know what caliber of revolver the British were using in 1938 for their military trainees, I have a problem. And I don't want to reboot my computer. So I like Antisocial. It's a great thing. And what it does is it allows me to free up some of my finite willpower to do other things. So I realize to some extent that makes it sound like this part of the talk makes it sound like I'm down on social media, but I'm really not. I absolutely love Twitter. I used to really enjoy Facebook before they made it all but unusable for me. I do use them for purely social relationships. Facebook in particular has a lot of friends of mine that are not professional and not fan folks, but I really am mostly going to talk about them in this setting from the professional uses. So first off, social media allows me to stay in touch with my fans and to build relationships with them, which is genuinely important. That fan that I'm talking to one-on-one is also the fan who says, hey, have you read Kelly McCullough's books? And they push my stuff, and they make sure that people are aware when I've got new stuff out, and that's great. This is particularly important for me as primarily a novelist, because I have one piece or maybe two pieces of work come out a year. And so staying on people's radar for the 6 months where there's dead time is not easy. Social media makes that much simpler. And also makes it easier for me to make sure those tuned-in fans who help me market things and who help get word about my books out know that stuff is coming out. So those are basic commercial uses, but I find it's another way for me to express my art as a writer. And this talk is, it's mostly about industry, which is very important to me. That's how I make my living. But fundamentally, the reason I do this is that I'm a creative soul, and I love the art. I love doing the actual work. So I'm primarily a novelist, though I do short stories and the graphic novel mentioned earlier. But more to the point, for social media, I also do stuff that I call them story fragments or idea fragments. There's no market for little tiny narrative pieces of weirdness or little tiny narrative pieces of silliness. There's no way to monetize that. But I am constantly producing them. So if I've got social media and I think, oh, this is a funny sentence, I can just throw it up, no context theater, whatever, hashtag it, and it's there, and it both brings in new readers and it keeps my old readers connected with what I'm doing. So it's a way to use something that used to get, hey, Laura, let me tell you about Princess Moina. Laura finds that leaking weirdness. The internet finds that entertaining. So suddenly I'm getting a chance to use that leaking weirdness in a way that promotes art. So it's allowed me to take something that was getting thrown away and use it. So one example of these little snippets I do is what I call bad noir. And here's one of the pieces. Morning arrived like a yak in a giant hamster ball. Confused, fuzzy, erratic, and don't get under it. Yeah, exactly. Not very useful in terms of a short story or a novel, but really a great thing to just throw up on Twitter. So in addition to that, I have a microfiction serial called Dragon Diaries. And this particular piece has generated so much fan interest that I'm currently working with a really talented artist and a book designer, and that will probably be my first indie project. And they're all up. All of the Bad Noir and all of the Dragon Diaries are up on my website. And let me tell you a little bit about how Dragon Diaries happened, and then I'll read a couple of them to you. So maybe 4 years ago, I was absolutely deathly ill. I had some horrendous stomach bug, and it rendered me incapable of basically reading or watching movies or writing anything at length. But as I noted earlier, if I'm not doing those things, I leak weirdness, especially if I'm not also reading. So I live narrative. So I started coming up with these little tiny half delirious snippets of fiction. And my lawyer would come down to check and make sure I wasn't dead and give me another Gatorade. I lived on Gatorade for a week and lost about 15 pounds. Not a good diet, but effective. And she would come down and I would give her a snippet of Dragon Diaries. And she said, let me just go get you your laptop. So I'm going to read a couple of them real quick. So these are all at Twitter length. Hatched today. A nice man was waiting for me with harness and food. He wanted to be my friend. I said yes. Then I aided him. I went to the barn. There were many animals. I aided them. Except the cat. I only tasted the cat. I did not eat it. Good cat. After I finished aiding the barn animals, I brought the cat in to sleep on my pillow. We will dream of fishies and aided them. Met a knight today. He tried to poke me with a sharp stick. I didn't let him. I did not aided him. How do you shuck a knight? And this is what my brain does when I'm delirious and half dead. And as it turns out, there's a market for that. So, like I said, Dragon Diaries is likely to be my first venture into the indie book market. And it came directly out of social media. Less directly, social media has become a huge tool for collaboration in my industry. Twitter is basically the water cooler of science fiction and fantasy publishing. It's where we hang out, we chat, we generate ideas, we play silly word games, and sometimes we build collaborations. So I wrote a trio of urban fantasy novels about the mid-90s. And these are, I call them my cursed books, because it's a 3-book set. Each one stands alone. I've had 3 major publishing deals shot out from under them. At one point in time, it had made it through the senior editorial process, and marketing killed it. Most recently, the editor who had gotten it through marketing this time was fired, and the project died. So I've had these 3 books. They're completely saleable, but I have not yet been able to get them out. And it's one of those things where it's like 3 novels on my hard drive doing nothing. So I'm like nattering on Twitter saying I should just rewrite these up to current standards and just put them out myself. And a friend of mine, Kyle Cassidy, who is a photographer, he's probably best known for his work with Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer. He was a photographer for Who Killed Amanda Palmer and for the Bed Song book and a couple of other things. So Kyle says, hey, I do covers. How about we kickstart this thing? I'll do all the photos. You do the rewrites. I'll set up the Kickstarter. We'll put these out. So that's very likely to be the next project. And it happened simply because I was nattering about it on Twitter. It hasn't happened yet, in part because, well, I'm fairly busy and productive. Kyle will send me an email saying, I'm really sorry I haven't had a chance to do anything about this, but the Dalai Lama called and wants me to come and do 3 days of photos. So the time I had for this is gone. Well, gosh, don't you think I'm more important than the Dalai Lama? No. Or, hey, I got this opportunity to spend a week with Wes Craven. Yeah, you go do that. So eventually it will probably happen. But, another thing that happened out of that thing. So Kyle and I were talking about this online. It's a conversation going on Twitter. I get an email maybe an hour later from a copy editor who's also a fan of my work, who says, hey, if you're doing this, I would love to be your copy editor. And I know how tough indie publishing is. I will cut you a deal. And so I've got a copy editor waiting in the wings who's willing to do this for what for her will be a reasonable price and what for me will be affordable, which for a good copy editor is not easy. Also, we've been planning on doing this entirely ebook because Kickstarter is great. The thing that kills you if you're doing a Kickstarter is if you've got physical deliverables. Shipping will just absolutely eat your life, both in terms of time and money. So I want to do this project entirely ebook. And that was one of the things that Kyle and I were discussing. And after we've been going back and forth about this for a couple of days, I got a note from a small press publisher I've worked with on other things who said, hey, when you get this off the ground, I'm going to send you a contract, take a look at it. I would love to do hardcover release of all of these books in sync with the Kickstarter. I will eat all of the production costs and deal with all of the marketing and all of the shipping. And again, that came out of Twitter. It would not have happened without social media. So as much as I've resisted it, I've absolutely come to love social media. It's allowed me to do things that simply weren't possible in the old days, not just in publishing. I come out of theater originally, as I mentioned earlier, and I occasionally get the itch to do something performance-wise. Now, before social media and the internet, if I wanted to do something performance-wise, I needed to either work with an established local theater group or book a venue. There were a bunch of hurdles to jump over. Not insurmountable, but the sort of instant gratification of the Dragon Diaries doesn't exist in theater. Well, it didn't. social media, cheap cameras, that has made life much, much simpler for doing that kind of thing. It's a way to do cool art. So let's see if I've got, are you still working? You are. This is a picture of my wife as the White Witch from Narnia's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and me as Mr. Tumnus. Now, my friend Neil Gaiman had gotten a lamppost installed out in his woods, and because he's Neil Gaiman, and his kids were like, "What do you buy a dad who can afford anything?" So they bought him a lamppost to put in the woods because he idly said something about it. And Laura and I were sitting around, and Laura said, "It'd be really fun to dress up as the White Witch and do a Narnia photo shoot." I said, "Hey, kids, I've got a barn. We can put on a show." So we did the costuming, and we got our friend Matt Cookta, who's a professor here and an absolutely incredibly good photographer. He's essentially a professional photographer, even though he doesn't make his living that way. And we did this photo shoot in the woods. When we went out to Neil's place, we showed up, and Neil's like, "Are you really going to go stand in knee-deep snow with no shirt on? I've got to see this." And so he blogged about it. And when Neil blogs about something, a couple 100,000 people see that. And my Twitter followers quintupled in about an hour. And I hadn't known that Neil was going to do this. This was not part of the plan. The entire plan was to do this photo shoot, put the pictures up, we're done. But suddenly my @mentions explode on Twitter. I get about 5 times the followers I had at that point in time, and I sell maybe 2,000 or 3,000 novels in a few hours. This was not part of the plan, but selling 2,000 or 3,000 novels in a few hours is, ooh, this could be a useful thought for future. I like doing this theater stuff. It's art. It expresses what I want to do. It also entertains people because the internet. And it's become it is both a marketing tool and something I can do for a lot of fun. So yeah, to this day, it's a close run whether more people know me for my own novels or for these pictures because Neil Gaiman. So we've done what we've come to call shenanigans projects over the years. For example, we built a 230-foot long snow dragon, and we set up a camera to film the production in time-lapse photography. So there are on the web, if you Google snow dragon and Neil Gaiman, that's the easiest way to get to it. You can get the time-lapse of this big field of snow being shaped into the snow dragon. I think there's like 1 or 2 flashes of these pictures because we were doing like 1 shot every 20 minutes or 1 shot every hour. And then the whole thing melting away to nothing. So that's one. Another one we did, this is a high-speed photography. We did science with snow and high-speed photography. It's called Snow Motion Science. There are a number of other people doing this. This is just the quick and easy GIF. And it's got a wonderful music piece going under it. It was a lot of fun. And I think there was some science generated. At least I hope so. One other one of these projects. My wife and I, every year on our anniversary, get dressed up in our wedding clothes and do a photo shoot. And this particular year, we borrowed Neil Gaiman's trampoline to produce the flying McCullough shot. And we have more stuff along these lines planned. I used to be part of a slapstick theater troupe, and we're discussing doing high-speed photography of people smashing vegetables over my head, watermelons, cream pies, for science. So not only do we reach new people, have a lot of fun, but there's, again, a long tail effect on these. These are all up on the internet. People are still stumbling on them. I still get email about them. They bring in new fans. It's just win-win-win. So I'm going to talk about that because, well, one of the things with this is it's got basically 0 distribution cost. It's worldwide and it's instantaneous. So this is a way that the internet has absolutely transformed what I call art time. Art time varies, from industry to industry. When I got into publishing, we had what we called speed of publishing. And speed of publishing is very, very slow. It takes about 2 years from starting a novel to seeing it in print. So it's about a year for you to write it. I write faster, so it's about half a year. But it's about a year, and then it's about a year of production time. And that's without submission. That's if it's under contract. And of course, it gets much longer if you're trying to sell it. Short stories used to be very similar. My very first short story, I think I sent it out, very first short story sale, I should clarify. There are some really bad short stories that don't count. But my very first short story sale went to 8 or 10 markets. And I had to print it, mail it, get my response all by email, all by mail. When it was bought at a time when everything was done by mail. So the editorial process happened by mail. It took, I think, 15 months from me selling the story, after about a year to sell it, about 15 months from sale to publication. Now that's changed absolutely radically. This was to a magazine called Weird Tales, which was published by Warren Lapine. Recently, I think it was October. Yeah, I have a timeline right here. I can look it up. So Warren sent me an email, and he said, "Hey, do you have any short stories in stock that you might want to send me? I'm starting a new magazine, Fantastic Tales of the Imagination." As it happens, I did, because when I shifted over to novels, short stories generally don't pay very well. There's some exceptions, but the opportunity cost of dealing with short stories just meant that when I was really getting solidly into novels, I just didn't have the time to deal with them. So I had a bunch of stuff, so I sent it along to Warren. Now, it took him a while to start reading it, but once he finally got a chance to read it, so I got an email from Warren on September 19th saying that he was reading the stories. On September 25th, 6 days later, he sent me an email asking to buy a story called Rope Burns, which was a fantasy western. And he asked me, he said, "I like it as it is, but do you have any edits you want to make?" I thought, I haven't looked at this novel in 5 years. I should probably do that. So I sat down, I went through, I made a bunch of small changes. I responded on the 26th with the changes. I got my contract on October 1st, signed it that day, the check went in the mail that day, and it was published that day. So time from acceptance to publication, 7 days, as opposed to 15 months with WebMage. So the internet has absolutely transformed our time. So in closing, technology has completely transformed my industry over the last 20 years. It's also transformed and enabled my art. Without the computer, I wouldn't be a writer. Without social media and the internet, I doubt I would be as successful as I am. I would have missed more opportunities than I can imagine. And not just publishing opportunities, artistic and life opportunities as well. When I started, I used a desktop machine that tied me to my office. Now with a laptop and the internet, I can write literally anywhere. I can find 10 square feet and a comfy place to sit. I've written fantasy on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and science fiction in a corner of the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. I've worked on a novel sitting in the Oxford pub where J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis met with their writers group, the Inklings. I've worked on edits and other stuff for various publishers in both hemispheres. I've made friends in the arts and sciences all over the world, and have been invited to do amazing things in wonderful places. Last summer, I recorded a message of comfort for a dying fan while walking in a tropical night near Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. I recorded the message on my phone, and then I was able to email him that night on the cell net, so he was able to get it. He died a few hours later. That was one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm sold. None of that would have been possible without when I started out. We live in an age of miracles and wonders, and thank you all. So I will be signing out there shortly. I've got about 5 minutes if anyone has any quick questions that I can knock off otherwise.
What do you think of the future of ebooks? I'm thinking of the scene in Men in Black where Tommy Lee Jones gripes that he's going to have to buy the White Album yet again when a new technology comes out.
I'm very hopeful. The sort of the exponential curve that we've been on in the way ebooks were coming out has started to level out some. I think that we will have the paper book and the Kodaks with us essentially forever. It's a 2,000-year-old technology that survived all sorts of artistic and industrial revolutions. But I'm very hopeful. Like I said, it pays me better. I would like to see DRM removed. I think that the digital rights management stuff that makes it very hard for you to port your digital book from place to place is just a disaster for the industry, and it's starting to come out. Bain isn't doing it anymore. Tor at Macmillan has dropped it. I think that making it easier for people to move their stuff will be a huge thing. One of the things that I think is particularly a problem is the walled garden stuff, like the Kindle. I mostly read on Kindle, but I do not like that it is such a proprietary format. Hopefully that covers what you're...
I guess my question is more about formats. I mean, you still have those 128K floppies with Word-perfect files on your Mac. All right.
This was a robust backup technology when I started. These days I use the cloud.
Transitioning from what you just said about Kindle, you didn't talk about that we're starting to see subscription model type things, seeing it with Kindle Unlimited, seeing it with ebook type or audiobooks. Have you been dabbling in that, and how has that affected?
I haven't really done anything with the subscription model stuff at all. I've got friends who run a small magazine called Uncanny that's been very successful. They just started a Patreon campaign, and they're up to $100 a month. They're hoping that between subscription and Patreon, they won't have to run a Kickstarter for a year or two. They're not sure, but that's very interesting. My friend Saladin Ahmed, who wrote a book called The Throne of the Crescent Moon, just started a Patreon campaign as well. So it's starting to allow particularly people who have extra resources who are particularly devoted to one artist. The 1,000 True Fans thing, I think, is I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. So there's a theory that was expounded a couple years ago that if you have 1,000 true fans of your work and you find some way to cater to them, that's enough. That's all you really need to make a living. I think it's probably going to vary by which part of the arts industry you're in. But the subscription models in Patreon and Kickstarter are making that more and more possible. And I'm seeing people, the short story as a career died for about 20 years. For a long time, you could write short stories and you could make a living. And for 20 or 25 years, you basically couldn't do that. But now that you can do the 99-cent short stories at Amazon and various other places, that's a possibility again. And the Patreon model and the subscription models are a way to do that. Actually, I'm thinking one of the things that we're going to see now that we haven't in a long time is novel length has basically been governed by paper technology. So the ideal novel is between 80,000 and about 120,000 words in terms of cost of printing and just all of the associated stuff. With ebooks, you're starting to get into a place where you can have a book that is 500,000 words, 700,000 words, these gigantic. I mean, Pat Rothfuss's trio is huge, and it was originally one book. It was originally one absolutely unpublishable book. But as an ebook, that's becoming publishable. And I'm also thinking that you're going to start seeing a spike in novellas, the 20,000, 25,000 words, which is a great length for reading on commutes. It's a really good natural length for a lot of writers, but there hasn't been any market for it because it's too big for a magazine and it's too small for a novel. So I think that we're going to see a saddle curve where those two sort of lengths become a viable media again.
I'm kind of fascinated with your theater background and your association with other artists, like graphic artists, and thinking of interesting ways that you can, put your theater work into and collaborate with these graphic artists and with your own work. This is very close to that, but have you thought of sort of making that?
I have worked on one project like that. The thing that I did for the National Science Foundation was a bunch of short stories illustrating physical science points, and I worked very closely with the illustrator. We developed the characters. I gave him the basic outline, and then we developed the characters based on the kind of art he did. So we were able to shape those characters that way, and then he did illustrations for that. And then the Dragon Diaries, which I mentioned earlier. The artist I've got and the book designer, they're storyboarding it out. Which one of these make a good story? They're pulling some stuff out that doesn't work as well with the whole thing, and then doing the art. And one thing I particularly love about that project is that my involvement in the project is about once a month, once every 2 months. I go to a meeting and they show me all of this amazing things they're doing with something I wrote 2 years ago, and I say, yes, I love that. That's beautiful. Or, oh, there's an internet image you need, and I'll pull something up and say, here's a good reference for that. And so I'm doing some of that with that as well. I love the chance to collaborate with other artists. One of the things that I loved about getting out of theater was not having to work with other actors. I mean, I like actors as people, but as a director, they don't do what you tell them to do all the time. When you're writing a book, you say, do this, and your characters do that, and that's great. But one of the things that I really miss about being theater is other actors, because they challenge you to do things that you would never have thought of. They make you up your game. And working with them, working with the scene designers, working with everybody who's involved in a production makes you think of things that you would never have done before. It's a huge chance for serendipity to create better art than you can create on your own. And I believe I'm out of time. Oh, yeah. Here.
How do you sign an ebook?
There are 3 established ways to do it at this point. There is a service online which allows you as an author to file your signature, and then they will, you do some back and forth, and they will electronically stamp the book with the electronic signature. The other 2 that I've seen is a lot of Kindles have the hardcover, and I've signed quite a few of those. And what I know is people who will have that, when the hardcover is filled up, they put it on their wall and they put new hardcover on. But they also do some skins, and so I've signed skins as well with a similar process.
A really answer for a facetious question.
People are weird. Did I see a...
I guess you sort of addressed this later in your talk. You said that when you said this, that social media does not count as writing, it made me think that it didn't. I mean, I understood you saying it didn't count as writing in the sense that it was not like directly making money for you. But do you think that having active social media presence can increase your sales? Because it seems like
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, social media. Like I said, I am, to a certain extent, I will be down on the social media because it does suck away time that I should be doing other things. But it's also been a huge boost for my career. I would not sell nearly as many books as I do if I were not active on social media and didn't have a pretty good presence there. And that's one of the ways it does that. That's purely serendipitous, and that is things that feel like writing but aren't writing but really are writing, which is the water cooler effect with other writers. So, for example, Kate Elliott, who is a fantasy author, fantastic person. I met her via Twitter. We've gone back and forth, and because of that, she started reading my books, and she was promoting them, and she sells probably an order of magnitude books more than I do. And the fact that people like Kate Elliott and Neil and other friends are aware of me and that I keep those connections going on social media is part of the things that sell book for me. That and just, being strange on the internet is apparently, like I said, monetizable. I do believe that brings the questions to close. You're welcome. I think that went fairly well.
You're still on.
Oh, hey.
All right. That concludes the lunch keynote. I'll see you guys back here at dinner at 6:15. So right back here at 6:15 for the award ceremony. Oh, one announcement. If you have an award that you are presenting and you have not met with me yet, please